Hi, I'm Brian English, Wappler Forum name Hyperbytes. In this module we're going to look at managing the roles for each of the individual users. Before we do that, I'm just going to go up here to globals into our community web security provider and just show you I have made some changes to that. So remember we added initially an administrator and a member where role equals A or role equals M. And I've just extended that. I didn't think you really needed to watch me doing that. It's just a straightforward repeat of the previous process. We now have business owners, role B. People entitled to add to the events calendar at role E. People who can add local history have H. People who can add local attractions, L. Your e-commerce will be T for trader, and last your buy-sell page will simply be S. So that will be our 8 main types of user within the website, and of course they can have one or more of those roles. What I want to do first, because I'm going to be using some SQL queries etc. to manage these users, I would actually like to create this information in the form of a table. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to create a new table, and within that table I'm going to, sorry, I'm doing something on the other screen there. I'm going to duplicate the information that we have within our security provider in table form. So I'm going to go into our database manager, I'm going to go into tables, I'm going to add a new table, and we're going to call this auth roles, authorized roles. Auth role ID, so you know I like to edit them, and then all we're going to do is we're going to add 2 fields. It's going to be the role, which will be that single letter, and we're going to have the role name. We'll apply that, add roles, there we are, that table has been created. And then I'm just going to manually update that table. There's absolutely no need to write a complete management unit for this. So role A is administrator, and so on we go. We've got our second role, M for member. Sorry, we're going to add new member. And then I'm going to write my spelling. I don't know whether you've noticed any eagle's eyes out there at the moment, but in actual fact in the provider itself I've misspelt the word administrator. I've missed out the second I. That might magically repair itself off screen, but it's a bit of a convoluted process, because if you change the name of that role within the security provider, then you actually have to reset all of the security restricts as well, because the name has changed. So it's about probably 30 or 40 changes I would need to make at this stage, so I really wouldn't subject you to that at this time. So I'm just going to now jump ahead, complete that table, and then we'll be back. So there we are, the miracles of technology. That table is now updated with all of the roles that we require. So I'm just going to save that. And why we've done that is because I'm going to be using that table as a reference to be able to work out what an individual has and what an individual doesn't have by means of a data query. Now, having had a little think, some may be aware, some may not, that I kind of make these up as I go along, to be honest, and just like to see where the journey takes me. My intention was to do a data join between the auth roles and the current roles, so that we could see which roles were present and which roles weren't, because we'd be identify a null. But in actual fact I'm going to need a right join to do that effectively, and of course, as we discussed earlier, SQLite does not support a right join at this time. So I'm actually going to do a huge big tactical change here. in terms of how we're going to do this. And I'm just going to use a completely different method, but just an effective method. It will be probably more familiar to you in terms of what I'm doing. However, it doesn't introduce the new technique I wanted to show you, so a little bit of a loss there. I'll see if I can work out how at a later stage in this course I can introduce you to the idea of using data joins. Basically, it's a flag to say whether somebody has or does not have a particular entity within a database. So let's not worry about it. Let's get back to the system. Basically, we've got our managed users. What I'm going to do is I'm going to create another dynamic modal here. We will be using dynamic modals quite a lot throughout this modal. We'll call that modal roles. Let's give it a title. You've got to learn to type what you need to type rather than what you're actually saying, Brian. So what we want to do now is we want to actually, first of all, I'm going to put a small list in here of the roles that the individual has at this time. And then I'm going to add a form at the bottom of this which allows them to be able to add roles to that list. So of course, first thing we need to do is look at, well, we've got our users, we've got our single user, but actually we don't know what roles they have. So all I'm going to do is I'm going to add another server action in here. And we're going to pull out all of the roles that that individual has. So we'll look at what we've got in terms of our queries at the minute. Our read query parameter is in fact the role ID, as is our search. I'm looking, I've completely forgot to put the filter in there even. So we're going to have to write a completely new API action here, but it's going to be a very simple one. So all we want to do is find out which roles a particular user has. Suppose technically we could have that in the users or the roles table. We're going to be passing a user ID by a get statement to that action. We're going to just pop our security stick in straight away. So you need to be an administrator to do this, otherwise you're going to be pushed over to a login. We can just copy and paste that. And now I'm going to add a database action. What we're going to do is we're going to do a database query, and we're going to ask for it to query the roles table and give us the appropriate role information relating to that user that we're dealing with. So that search will be very, very simple. It will search that roles table and find all the roles which are associated with that user ID. Nice simple one, that one. If we go back now to our user management, I obviously need to add that server action in within our page. So I'm going to data. We've got our server connect. I'm going to ask it to call up that admin role user roles API action. Let's give that a new title. And that one again, we're not actually going to be loading that in until within this modal. So we're not going to load that automatically. So very, very similar this to the previous actions that we had before at this stage. Now on the button click of that roles icon within our dynamic events, what we're going on our mouse click, we're going to run a flow. And in that flow, first of all, I'm going to add an action. I'm going to flow control, run. And I'm going to call that user role server action. Notice this is a slightly different way that I've done it before. Before I've done this on a run action from within the triangle here. This time I'm doing the same thing within a flow by saying run the flow and then run, and the user ID, as we've already seen so many times, is the user ID within this repeat here, our table body. But I mentioned before, and I said there's an error, and then I said, oh no, it's not an error. Sorry, I'm thinking of somewhere else. This is where the error comes in. And that has been reported to the team. I'm sure they'll be fixing it. But you see there with prefixes, table repeat 0 dot. That should actually just be user ID and nothing else. So that's a manual fix you'll have to put in until such time as the team manage to fix that one. So that's going to load that action, and now that will pull all of the users that we need, those user roles, into our server action. So I'm going to just select that for the moment, and let's save that. We can see that that has saved, as you can see that the flow is running. What we can now do is we can actually create a table within our roles modal. So I'm going to just go into our table generator, generators, bootstrap 5 table, populate it from the user roles table. I will be changing this because you'll see an issue soon. Something that I should have quickly thought of there, but not to worry. So there basically we have our page saved. I don't know why I closed that accidentally, but let's not worry about it. Our admin and its users. So now if we click that button, what's going to happen? Well, it's going to run that flow. We also need it to open our modal. So again, we can add we can either stack this one, as I said before, or we can just run this separately. I like to keep it separate just so you can see exactly what I'm doing. We also need to pop open that roles modal, and that roles modal then should show a very simple list of the roles that are available to that individual. Let's just fire that up. Let's click that. You see there, we can see we have user 14, which is this user, has roles as a member and also as an administrator. But it'd be nice to actually, we could see the full title of that role. So if we go back into our server action, sorry, our API action from that user roles query, what we can do is we can add a join there to that auth roles, an inner join. We'll add the role name, and that way we can see a text version of the author, the particular role as well. And if I go back now into our manage users and into our action, roles, I'm just going to rerun that generator now. So there's no reason why we can't. Once you start to add a lot of code in there, you've got to be careful on this because running the generator can clear some of the code. But in the short term, we'll just run that again. And actually, we don't need to see the role ID. We don't need to see the user ID because I know whose it's going to be. But what I would like to do is add in that name. So, sorry, wrong one. User role, data, query. Add that. That's added in those again. I'll just quickly take those out. We don't need the role ID. We don't need the user ID, we just need to see what the role name and the role is. Okay, let's save that again. Let's fire that up in the browser just so you can see what's happening. That looks better now. It shows you member M, administrator A. What we're going to do now is we're just going to pop a little delete button in here to remove them. Then we're going to add a form in the bottom here so that you can add the roles as you require them. So let's go back into that now. We're back into our modal, our table. Come on, you little devil. Normally that modal will pop up on our screen and just when you want it to. It's not doing it, not to worry. There's our modal, there's our table. We've got our row. I'm just going to add a header after that. And I'm going to add a cell in the actual table itself. Really could do with that modal screen popping up. I'm not quite sure why it's not doing it. I'm going to save that page. I'm going to close it and I'm going to open it again. That's better. It's now opening up the modal as we'd want it. You see the role name, role. I want to change that. I'll remove that word header in our cell within our table repeat. I'm going to add a button. You'll have seen this all before 1,000, well not 1,000 times, but quite a few times as we've gone through the system. And what am I going to do now? Of course, I'm going to add that font awesome icon. I'm going to add a trash bin. I'm going to make that a bit bigger. I'm going to just make that icon red by adding the style to danger. Save ourselves there. There's our modal now. You can see that we've got the icon there. It's a server restrict that's stopping this showing up properly because I'm not actually logged in at the moment within this. But if we now just run this in our web browser, click on that, you can see now we do have that button there. Just going to go back into Wappler. I'm just going to, probably the easiest way at this point is I'm just going to pop into code view. Remove that word cell. I'm going to remove the text button. So all we're left with is a trash icon. Save that. Let's just fire it up again just to make sure we've got it right. That's what we want there. We've got our, so we're going to have a delete action attached to these buttons, and then afterwards we're going to add a form at the bottom of here to be able to add those roles as we need them. So let's go back into our modal again. We don't need that save changes button. Let's get rid of that. While we're busy, let's just give that modal header a little bit of color. Let's give it a green header, white text. Let's get rid of that paragraph that was auto added because we don't need that. What we need to do is in our button that we have, we need to add an action, and that action is going to be to delete that specific role as defined by its role ID. So we're going to be on that button. I'm not going to bother with the boot box dialog on this. This is going to be an instant because it's so easy to add it back in again. So we're just going to add dynamic events. We're going to have our mouse click. We're going to fire up a flow, and I'm going to, within that flow, run a data source server connect. We're going to select our server action within our roles. We're going to select our delete role action, and we're going to pick that role ID out of that repeat again. So we're sending the role ID, sorry, looking in completely the wrong place. I'm going to send our role ID from the repeat within our dynamic button there. It'd probably be good to start naming these tables a bit more clearly, because eventually if you end up with lots of table repeat 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, can get confusing. I'm not going to do it on this particular time, but we'll do that in the future, and we need to pick the role ID from there. So now if we click on this button here, it's going, sorry, this button, the delete button within our modal. So in our modal, we click our delete button, it'll run that server action and it will delete that entry. We really should, after that though, if we remember, we need to refresh the server action so that the list is cleared up completely. So I'm going to add another action where it's going to flow control run, and we're just going to do that user roles query, and we're just going to force a reload on that so that that refreshes correctly. I'm not going to delete anything yet because I want to be able to add a role in before I delete something. Otherwise I could end up actually having to delete the administrator role, which would be a bit difficult for me to then continue. So what we're going to do now is we're going to add that add role section. Now once we've got the add role section, we can look at checking that delete action. So save that off. Let's now go back into our modal. What we're going to do now is add a form into the bottom of that. So just below our table, our responsive table, I'm just going to drag this down a little bit just to give us a bit more space because it's getting a bit crowded up there. We've got our modal body, we've got our table. Immediately after our table, we want to add a form. Within that form, what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a drop-down list. Select form, as it's called. We've got our horizontal select, and it by default will add a couple of manual entries in there. I'm just going to delete all of them off because we're actually going to use a data source for that, and that data source is going to be our list of roles. Now I'll just pop over here. Remember we got that user roles query, which does nothing more than just list. No, I'm sorry, that's not, we haven't written that query yet. We want just a nice simple query here. My apologies for all roles. Add our action. We can security restrict it to our administrator, and we're going to have our login action for those who are not authorized to do that. And then I'm going to add a very simple data query, database actions, database query. We've got more than one record, and all I'm going to do is query that auth roles table and return all of our fields. Just for sake of prettiness, I suppose, let's sort it on the role letter itself. No, actually I'm not. We'll sort it on the role name, just so it will appear alphabeticized. I think that's the first time we've looked at sorting. Okay, so let's save that. Back into our manage users now, and what we're going to do is we're going to say that we want a dynamic select. So we're choosing a data source, which we can't do yet because we need to add it in here first. So let's go into our connections. This is going to be con all roles. We're going to pick that action that we've just returned, which does nothing more than list those, I think, 8 roles, if I remember rightly, that we set up previously. Into our form, our select, our data source is going to be that query that we've just added in, our all roles query. And from there we can say, right, well, the text field that will appear in there will be that role name, but actually the value that we're going to use, that we're going to push into the database, is simply that role letter. We'll give that form item a name. I'm also going to give it a meaningful ID. So what will happen now is that we'll be able to do that drop down here. We'll be able to pull those values pull those values down in here. We'll be able to select the one we want, and when we add the button, we'll be able to also submit that to a server action. So we've got our vertical form group with our select in. I'm just going to now add a nice simple vertical submit. If we have a predefined one, no we don't worry about it. I'm just going to add in that case a straightforward button. A button is an add role button. Come on. So we'll give it that title. Let's give it a green color because it's a positive action. Let's save that. Now all we need to do is to be able to create a simple API action that will write that role to it. But to be able to write that role, it also needs to know which particular user it is dealing with. So we also need, as well as sending the role, we need to send to that the next API action the user ID of the current user as well. What we're going to do is we're just going to add that in as a text input, but we're actually going to hide it so that the users can't actually see that. It's a hidden one. We're going to call it user ID for obvious reasons, and then we're going to give it a default value. So if we go into dynamic attributes and input value, click on that, we can now tell it to, remember we're still dealing with our con single user parent record here. That's still selected, so we can from there select our user ID. Just thinking, can we get it from elsewhere? We have our user roles data query. Yeah, we pull it from there, and that's a little bit cleaner, I think. Save that. Actually, what I'm going to do now, it's something I'd suggest that you get in the habit of doing is, I'm not going to go straight into hidden. I'm going to leave that text. And the reason I'm going to do that is I want to be able to make sure that that value is set properly before I hide it. So let's pop that in. Let's hit that role. We can see there that that hidden value is indeed 14, as it should be. That's a current user's user ID. So we know that that form is being set properly, and we've got our drop down list of all of our users there as well. So back in our Wappler screen, what else do we need to do? We need to create that API action. We'll call this a role related event rather than a user one, although it's questionable, it could be either. We'll call that add role to user. It's going to get sent two parameters, and these are going to be post parameters because they're coming from a form, and it's going to be user ID, and we're going to be sending a value of a role.
I didn't catch that. Can you
Sorry, my phone decided to start talking to me. And the basic action there is a very simple one. We're just going to database insert. Again, we need to make sure that this is hack proof, so we're going to add our administrator requirement. And And now we're going to do a database insert, and we're going to insert into our role table. The user ID will be the posted user ID, and the role will be the role table. So let's save that. Back into our manage users page, into that form. That's going to be a server connect form. The server action will be that action that we've just written, which is add role to user. Let's save that. Let's just double check that button is a submit button. No, we need to make sure that's a submit button. And then within the success event of that form, and I'm not going to add the unauthorized and error ones in. You're quite capable of doing that yourselves now. I'm just going to say on success, because it's the important one. We're going to pop up a notification to say role added. We're then going to refresh our role table. And that's all we need to do, because I don't actually want to close the modal. I want them to be able to see the appropriate change. So that should be everything. We also remember talking about there is a close event in the modal roles, but as we don't have a form as such, I'm not going to worry too much about that. We also, of course, we need to just hide that entry there. And if all goes well, we now have that role management fully functional. So let's first of all, let's add by cell. Okay, now we can see that something's gone wrong there. That form didn't refresh properly. If I remove that again, that hasn't refreshed properly. So we do need to find out what's going on there. The data is correct. It's something is going wrong in the action at the end of that, and we need to just have a look at our server action. Actually, I think rather than jumping straight back in the code, probably an opportune time to show you how to use the development console as a debugging aid. So we've obviously got a few bugs here, and rather than trying to work it out through the code, let's allow the developer console to do that. So for any of you who haven't used it before, it is simply a case of click on the three dots, more tools and developers tools in Chrome. There's equivalent in every other browser as well. There is also a shortcut code there for you once you get in the hang of doing it. Great thing about this is when you are running the actions, you will get outputs here. We're in the network tab. We're in the fetch XHR section of that, and if I refresh that action, you'll see that it shows us the server actions as they're running. So it's getting the all roles query, it's giving us the search filter parameter that isn't being used because we've got nothing here. We now hit our roles button, and we can see that we have some roles there. Excuse me. What we need to do now is have a look and just see why this isn't working. So we'll start with our delete action. Let's say we'll just delete this history action here. What's happened? Well, first of all, we see delete rule ID equals 14. So it's running the delete action, it's sending the role ID, and it's sending the number 14. And this makes me a little suspicious here, because we're using user ID as 14, that we may well actually be sending the user ID rather than the ID of that specific role entry in that server action. And that would certainly explain what we're seeing. And secondly, we see that once we refresh that user roles server connection, there's no data returned, and we would expect to see a parameter after that to say that we're actually looking for user roles, in this case our user number 14. So I suspect that we're missing a parameter there within the call of that particular API action. Then if I just quickly refresh that again, let's just open that up, and let's have a look if we try to add a event. Let's say we want to add member. No, we've got member. Let's say we want to add e-commerce into there. So we're watching what's happening over here. We're going to hit add role. The add role, the user action has worked fine, but again we're actually seeing we're missing a parameter on the user roles. So I think we've got probably three problems here. We're sending a user ID rather than role ID in a delete action, and when we're refreshing that list that we see here, we're actually forgetting to tell it the user ID of the person to which that list must apply. So that should be a fairly straightforward change to make on the code. So what we'll do is we'll pop back into Wappler and we will have a look and see where those code changes need to be made. So let's back into Wappler and let's see if our suspicions are confirmed. So we'll start first of all, we'll go into our roles modal. We're going to look at our table and we're going to look at the button, which is the delete button within that action. It's running a flow, so we're going to hit the edit flow. This is our delete action that we're running there, calling our server connect to delete. And I can actually see there straight away that we've got to mention a user ID. Let's open that up. And yes, our suspicions were correct. We've actually sent the user ID to that action where we should be sending the role ID. So we'll take that out. We're going into our table repeat, which is where we should be picking it from. That's our list on the screen, and we're going to select the role ID there. And that should correct that problem. What's the second one? Well, the second one was after that the list is not being refreshed properly. So again, we need to be in that form in that table. We're looking at our button. Let's have another look at our click event. And we can see straight away that when we're doing the load, we're not passing the parameter of that user ID that we normally would. Now that strikes me that actually there is a sort of hidden problem number 4 in this as well. So remember, whenever we clicked on the delete buttons and the edit buttons, we've always run this single user action here just to make sure that we have access to all of the data for that user. And what I would like to do is to actually run that on the click event of that button, just so we know that we've got all those appropriate user IDs set in stone in that server action. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to cancel that now. I'm going to go to that button. If you remember, we ran a flow there, but in actual fact I also want to add another action, data flow run, and what we want to do is run that single user query load, and we're going to use the user ID parameter obviously for that, so that is the one that is inside our repeat. You can generally tell that you've got the right entry simply by whether it's prefixed with the user or not, because that should just say user ID only. So I'm just going to take that out totally. And this is a problem I found in flows, that in flows specifically, when we go into this action, it does sometimes put that preamble in first. Just delete it out and use that. Let's select that. So we're now going to load in that single user data. We're going to get their user roles. We're going to open up that modal there. Save that. And now if we go back into our action as before, I'm sorry this is getting a bit complicated, but it's, that's life as a web dev, I'm afraid. If we go back into our button, our flow in there, and this is now in the modals button within our modal roles. When we run that, click on here and you'll see that we need to populate that user ID parameter, and we're going to take that from that single user query that we've just set up there. Okay, so we'll save that. What was the other place? The other place we had a problem with was in the form itself. We had exactly the same problem, didn't we? So when we actually added something new in there, we also got the same problem. So we're in our form, our success action. Don't forget, you should be adding your unauthorized and error actions in here as well. User role, and we see exactly the same problem there. So again, we know that that single user action contains the data that we need. So let's just select that. Let's hit the save. So they've got that. I'm just going to double check these again to make sure that we have got them definitely right and have saved as we want. Yeah, it all looks good. Let's save that. Now let's try again. So let's fire up that action. Let's call that up. We can see our roles here. Let's remove that history entry, and it's still not working, which is going to drive me bonkers. Is that a refresh issue, or is that it didn't delete? Sorry, we see role ID equals undefined here, so that's picking up the wrong role ID by the looks of it. It's turning out to be a better debugging session than it is learning session in terms of code here, but this is really important that you are able to do this. So for some reason it doesn't like that modal role blah blah blah, and it probably, as I explained before, yeah, we need to just take all that preamble out and just change that to a simple role ID. Generally, if ever you see a brackets 0 brackets off at the end, it's an indication that for some reason that's not working properly. Okay, open it up again. There we go. History, yeah, that's gone now. That list is refreshed exactly how it should. If we go into history and add that role back in, brilliant, that's added it back in. So that's the action working perfectly. So we've learned how to do that add and remove of roles, but I hope also you found this particular unit useful in terms of how to use a development console to debug your server actions when they don't do what you were hoping them to do. So I hope you join me in the next module, and we'll be looking very soon at blogging.